So welcome to the HKS Energy Policy Seminar. I'm Joe Aldi. I'll serve as the host for today's session. Thrilled to have everyone here in the room, as well as our friends and colleagues and alumni joining us online today for the seminar. We're really excited to have with us today Conleigh Byers for a talk, The Future of Resource Adequacy in a Decarbonized Grid. Dr. Byers is a Harvard Environmental Fellow through the Harvard University Center for the Environment. Received her PhD in electrical engineering from ETH Zurich, doing research on some very important and challenging questions. So we're looking forward to learning about the research here, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. Conleigh, welcome to the Energy Policy Seminar.
Thank you. Happy to be here. And thank you all for coming out today. So the subject of this talk is resource adequacy as we transition to a system with more and more variable renewables and storage. So what changes about that question? And this is a difficult problem. And for this presentation, we're going to do a lot of learning about how to define that problem, the greater framework that fits into. And you'll see a bit of the work in progress for my research agenda right now. So over 100 countries have pledged to become carbon neutral by 2050, including the European Union and the United States, which has a goal of 100% carbon-free electricity by 2035. Now, meeting that goal would be a big challenge, and to do so, we would need a projected 2 to 3 times as much electric generating capacity by 2050 as we have today. So we're going to need to build a lot of new resources. At the same time, we've had a series of events in recent years that raises the question of whether our market designs are up for the challenge of a decarbonized world. In Texas in 2021, there was a winter storm that led to outages in the power grid for several days, prices spiking, some load-serving entities went bankrupt who weren't very well hedged. We also saw Australia in the summer of 2022 suspend its electricity market during times of scarcity instead of charging those high prices. And after Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the subsequent natural gas energy price spikes, Europe had regulators discussing whether they wanted to return to average cost pricing typical of regulated monopolies rather than see prices spike so much in the energy market. So this tension then has become heightened between market outcomes and central planning. At the same time, we have a lot of new generation after the IRA subsidies especially that want to be built in the United States, but they're getting backlogged in queues that keep growing longer and longer. So here in this figure, we're seeing that for solar, storage, and wind, year on year, we're adding more and more generation to these queues, but they're not leaving at a similar rate. So we have about 1,250 gigawatts of zero carbon resources that want to get connected, but the wait times for getting them online has increased year on year. So this brings us to the question of what resource adequacy is. So its most basic definition is, do we have enough resources, and by that we typically mean generators, installed on the grid to meet load at an acceptable level of reliability? Now, this historic goal was 1 day in 10 years, and you might have seen this before, that this was a goal for a lot of power systems. Okay, we want to have an outage only 1 day in 10 years. However, that's some kind of heuristic, right? It's not based on any kind of careful cost-benefit analysis. And that raises the question, what is the economically efficient level of resource adequacy? How much should we really be building? At the same time, we're transitioning from a capacity-limited paradigm in which we thought, how many of these thermal generators do we need to build to meet peak load, to an energy-limited paradigm in which we have to figure out how do all these variable renewables that are weather-dependent interact with the storage system, and how do we make sure that there's enough energy when we need it? This problem is complicated not only by the availability of generators, but also by demand. Do we consider demand to be inelastic or fixed, in which case we have to come up with some value of lost load when we're calculating how much resources we think we should build optimally. If demand is price responsive, then that's going to change how much resources we should build, because at a certain point, it would be better to stop building rather than build for demand that's not that interested in being served at that time. Additionally, we have transmission complicating the picture, both in terms of building out new transmission capacity, but also in terms of how we operate the system in real time. When it's actually in these scarcity conditions and we have congestion, will we be able to get the resources that we built at one node in the network to the demand at some other node in the network? The next question then is, can we rely on short-term markets for long-term resource adequacy? The problems, as we saw in these examples to start with, is reliability, right? Will the system be there, or will it experience an outage when you want it to be there? We are also concerned about cost to consumers. We're concerned about the overall cost of the system to consumers, but we're also concerned about protecting consumers from high prices. And finally, we also want to get this new generation built fast. The new context we're operating in is a lot of zero variable resources and storage, and a context that we've been operating in before, but maybe need to take better account, is the risk aversion, not only of investors, but of consumers and the system operator. So what this presentation will be looking at is building up to this new proposal of, in lieu of a capacity market or in lieu of centralized procurement, what would be close to a first best market solution for this problem? And that's what we'll look at today, is this idea of a mandatory forward market for energy. The landscape we're operating in consists of electricity markets as well as various forms of clean energy policy. So under the banner of electricity markets, we have energy markets, which trade in energy, so megawatt hours. We also have ancillary services that are needed for keeping the voltage or frequency support of the grid up and running, or uncertainty at market intervals below what the energy market can clear. And then in some jurisdictions, we also have capacity markets, which trade in megawatts, so power. For clean energy policy, there's also a lot of different factors at play. We have renewable energy certificates. We also have subsidies, such as from the IRA. And we have potentially government-directed procurement, where some regulator says we should build exactly this amount of this type of resource. Now, the ideal link between clean energy policy and electricity markets would, of course, be to have a carbon tax. However, in the absence of having a carbon tax, we're left with a bit of a conundrum. So recently, there was Senate hearings for the new FERC commissioner nominees, which includes Judy Chang, who's a lecturer at the Kennedy School currently. And a question that came up over and over again was, is FERC an economic regulator or an environmental regulator? And while we can probably guess what we think the correct answer to this question was, it was that FERC is an economic regulator. But if we're asking electricity markets to work well with clean energy policy, we have to consider that what we're asking them to do is for a market to solve a problem for carbon without pricing carbon. Now, you can do that in some other way, right? If you had a lot of subsidies coming into a market, the market can still find a new equilibrium. But then you have to think about what is the repercussion of that. So if you're an investor, you expect some level of risk, certainly, in a competitive market. A new entrant could come in, say, a new battery storage device that has much, much cheaper capital costs than existing battery storage devices. It could potentially price you out of the market. That's a risk that you have to accept in a competitive market. But if a new resource comes in because it has a lot of government-backed subsidies, and those subsidies could come at different times, and you've already invested with this certain projection of what you think your profitability would be, and now that's changed. So we can call this a kind of regulatory risk. And now we have this question, should we compensate losers for this kind of regulatory risk? If we do, it comes at some cost to consumers, of course, who are going to be footing that bill. But if we don't, potentially we could risk higher investor hurdle rates in the future. And so this means investors might raise their endogenous cost of capital and leading to a more expensive system overall. So we have to kind of balance these two things. If we're trying to solve for resource adequacy, it's important to have a strong analytical engine at the core of that. So let's take a step back to first principles and think about what resources should we build to maximize social welfare. We could formulate this as an optimization problem in which there is a central planner who is maximizing social welfare. Alternatively, we could formulate this as an equilibrium problem. So this is a model of the market in which each individual agent in the market, consumers, producers, the system operator, are trying to maximize their individual benefit. Now, if we make some assumptions, we can make the optimality conditions of these two problems equivalent. So the social welfare maximizing central planner resource mix is the same mix that a competitive market with marginal pricing would choose. So then central planning and market outcomes can be equivalent, at least in theory. So if they're equivalent, why are we trying to have markets for this complex engineering system? Well, it is true that you could find this same theoretical social surplus or social welfare using markets or using planning. But in practice, we have imperfect markets, but we also have imperfect central planning, right? Typically, a central planner is going to be some form of regulated monopoly. The bet that we're making if we choose markets as a tool to elicit what we hope is the highest social welfare we can is that they will do a better job of it than we would have done with that imperfect central planner. And we have good reason to believe this in more developed economies. You know, a monopolist has information asymmetry with the regulator. They don't necessarily have a strong incentive for service quality, and there can be a lack of incentive to innovate, especially if you can pass prices on to consumers. A natural next question is, why can't we achieve that maximum theoretical social surplus? Also, there are these reasons of, what makes a market imperfect, and a few of these are externalities that are not necessarily accounted for. So an easy one to understand is environmental externalities, right? Air, water, land pollution, all of these things come about when we're building power plants, especially fossil fuel power plants traditionally, also emit a lot of greenhouse gases. And we do have, ways we could price that. We could use a carbon price, for instance. Another externality is reliability. So right now, we typically have price caps in most energy markets, and this leads to an incentive for under-procurement. We also have reliability acting as something like a common pool resource where there could be an insufficient incentive to hedge if a consumer is just as likely as another consumer to be cut off during a blackout, which could certainly happen due to the nature of the power grid. A third externality is the power grid itself is the network of the transmission distribution system. Electricity follows the laws of physics, not economics. So if you have an injection or withdrawal at some point in the network, it could change the entire flow of electricity through that network. When we're thinking about electricity market design, there's a lot of different assumptions that we make before we start looking at different solutions. So for instance, some markets may decide that the convexity of the market is something they want to assume from the start. Others might find that that's something that they want to explicitly deal with. There's also jurisdictions that think about the ideal being a copper plate system, whereas others really take into account the meshed nature of the electricity network. So these were a couple topics that I covered in my dissertation previously. Now, we have all of these different decisions we might make in electricity market design and these assumptions, but are they very impactful? Well, the different problem descriptions that we have can yield very different results. So as a simple example, if we assume something about transmission, that our ideal is this copper plate system, where we kind of want to abstract away most of the engineering physics of the grid, you might end up with something like the European system, where markets are cleared mostly along national borders in these single country bidding zones. This contrasts to locational marginal pricing, which is in use in many markets in the world, including all liberalized electricity markets in the US. And that would lead you to have thousands of different nodes. If Europe switched from zonal to nodal pricing, estimates are that there would be operational savings of several billion euros per year, And in addition to that, you would have different investment signals. So the resource mix that each of those systems would build in the long run would also differ in a way that really may impact consumer welfare a lot in the long run. Another common difference between electricity markets is, do you take a strategy of having an energy-only market, or do you take a strategy of having an energy market and a capacity market? In the United States, ERCOT is our representative of this energy-only market style design, and it had high price caps, about 9,000 before Winter Storm Uri, which has now been dropped by the regulator down to 5,000. Another energy-only market is the National Electricity Market of Australia, who have a price cap of about 10,000 USD. In contrast, markets like PJM or ISO New England have a capacity market, which usually these auctions are also in the billions, but they also typically couple that with a much lower price cap, here about $1,000. Finding solutions for market problems without really understanding what problem we're trying to solve or what our assumptions are can be very expensive. Texas, after Winter Storm Uri, introduced a new reserve product. But the independent market monitor estimates that that reserve product didn't really provide a benefit to consumers, but it cost consumers just over, from the summer to the fall of that year, $12 billion. So it's always important when we're looking at these different designs, different pathways we might take, to consider the counterfactual and make sure that we're modeling that appropriately. Today, we're mostly going to be focused on this branch of the decision tree around this reliability and hedging problem, which means we're going to have to think about, do we want to have scarcity pricing? Do we want to have price caps? Do we want to have mandatory hedging? Or are we going to only rely on voluntary contracts? So first, we'll try to develop a strong analytical framework. So we saw before that to get the marginal prices that provide this optimal operational and investment signal, which we'll call full strength prices, that this is equivalent to that perfect central planner solution. So what happens when prices aren't full strength? In the California ISO in 2022, there was a summer heat wave in September, and California has a fairly low price cap. The price cap was hit pretty early in the day, before noon, and that's when batteries started discharging. But this was early relative to when the actual net peak load was later in the day. But since that price didn't rise further, batteries didn't have any signal that they would have really done better for the grid and to prevent an outage if they had waited to dispatch until later. So the operator has to then come and step in and start taking over and telling batteries when they need to charge and when they need to discharge in order to prevent an outage. So what we saw in this case was that having that price cap, having less than full strength prices, sent a bad operational signal. The resources were dispatched at a suboptimal time. And we can only imagine that this will become more and more important as we rely on more storage in energy limited paradigms in the future. This also wasn't a very good investment signal. Left to its own devices, this system would underinvest in flexibility because it didn't get a signal saying that it was needed. When we don't have full strength prices, we have energy price suppression. So what does that mean graphically? Ordinarily, we've had some point at which demand, which has to be a little bit elastic for this graphic to work, has to intersect the supply curve, and that will be the scarcity price. It's a price higher than the highest marginal cost generator, which is a big part of how generators are able to recover their capital costs. However, if there was a price cap in this market, we'd find something different. There might be a lot of reasons for price caps. So one could be political, simply that regulators don't like seeing prices that high because it's not popular or it's politically risky. Another could be offer caps, which can be due to some valid market power concerns, but we've seen, what's a consequence of that is also then you might have the system operator taking out of market actions. Also, if demand is assumed to be perfectly inelastic, it's never going to intersect that supply curve. And so you have to make some kind of central administrative decision about what that price should be. However, if you have these kinds of price caps, this energy price suppression, you then have some missing revenue. The consequence of that is that resources need a secondary revenue stream outside of the energy market in order to recover their capital costs. In the future, when we're looking at scenarios with low emissions, so here on the right in this figure, we're seeing that prices in the top 2% of hours are spiking much more. We see a lot more zero price hours and a lot more hours in which prices are over 200 or even over 1,000 to make this system work. So again, there's nothing theoretically that changes when you add a lot of zero variable resources and storage to a system. You can still recover those capital costs via the energy market, but that price distribution is going to look pretty different. And when that price distribution looks different, has this much more of this positive skew, this could be a problem or a challenge for more risk-averse investors. One potential solution to this problem, which is implemented in a lot of markets today, is some form of a capacity mechanism or a capacity market. In this paradigm, you have a price cap, and then you have a capacity market to make up for that missing revenue that you didn't get in the energy market. So the idea of this is that it is a forward market for generating capacity, or megawatts, that are estimated to be available during future scarcity conditions. And currently, in markets that have capacity markets, we've seen a lot of growth in the extent of those markets, even as we have high reserve margins or high amounts of capacity surplus in those markets. So this does really beg the question, are we really getting what we think we're paying for? If in PJM or ISN New England, capacity has risen to be over 20% of total costs, while at the same time, capacity seems to be in surplus. So what are some downsides of capacity markets? One of them is that performance penalties are typically pretty weak. In their ideal form, they could be conceived of as a call option, where you would pay a high spot price if you don't deliver in real time. However, in reality, usually these penalties are formulated just as a transfer among producer surplus. And what that means is at the end of the day, if you're a consumer, you don't get anything. If that resource wasn't available in real time, you're not compensated for that. These markets are also rather distortionary because they're not based on that underlying marginal price. So part of the revenue that would have been made up by that marginal price is being applied equally to all resources, no matter where they are in the grid. So this also means that there's a lack of incentive to invest in flexibility. Finally, it's also not clear what the firm capacity of variable resources and storage is. So here on the right, we see this figure where in recent years, we've had, solar could be 0% in the winter capacity, firm capacity value, to 60% in PJM in the summer. So these range a lot, and they should range a lot, because really the marginal value of solar or wind on a system is going to change every time you add new resources to that system. So it's not a very easy problem to solve, and it's definitely not something that will be consistent year on year. Another downside of capacity markets, which I think is an underappreciated downside, is their impact on this interconnection queue problem, their impact on getting new resources onto the grid. So of course, a disclaimer, a lot of this is also permitting problems in getting new resources on the grid, but part of it is certainly due to the fact that in a capacity market, you need to have some resources that have what's called deliverable capacity, meaning that you are estimating via some engineering judgments that that capacity would be deliverable in real time during a future scarcity condition, given the configuration of the transmission system. This leads to costly and lengthy interconnection studies, and as those studies get longer and longer, you have more producers that will submit a lot of different bids for different resources in the hopes that one of them gets approved. And now once that one gets approved, they'll withdraw their other bids, but now that means you need to redo all the other existing interconnection studies in the queue because one of the resources, a node in that network, changed. There's also an issue with this idea because it does lead to some anti-competitive behavior or some incumbent bias. So the idea that every resource needs to have deliverable capacity means that if there's a fixed transmission system currently, and I could come online and meet load for a much lower price. I'm not allowed to because somebody else is already using that transmission capacity. Finally, this deliverable capacity means that you're forced into an approach to add new resources to the grid of what's called invest and connect. So meaning that you need to make myopic marginal upgrades each time a new resource wants to come online. And this can be a very difficult process. Rather than in some markets, you can use instead a connect and manage approach, which means that you can connect to the grid quickly. There's some risk that maybe you won't be able to deliver all of your capacity at peak, but that could be a good trade-off if it means that you can get online faster and you can hedge that risk in some other way. When we look at the time between interconnection request and interconnection agreement in the US right now, we see that a lot of markets with capacity markets have much longer interconnection times. So PJM, it's over 3 years currently, whereas in ERCOT, which doesn't have a capacity market and follows this connect and manage approach, it's less than 2 years. So if we don't think that capacity markets are a great market-based solution for the problems that we've identified, what would be an alternative? One would be to have long-term forward contracting. And by this, we mean forward energy contracting rather than forward capacity contracting. One advantage of this is that all the players would be hedged in such a way that the system collectively could be more comfortable with those full strength prices, allowing prices to have the volatility that they need to have to appropriately signal where flexibility is needed in the system and to reward that flexibility. Consumers would be protected from high prices, which was a problem both in Texas and Europe in these recent energy crises. Additionally, producers would have a counterparty for a long-term contract that they wanted to enter, which could help with project financing, meaning that it's less expensive to build this plant if I can show to whoever's funding me that I have this steady revenue stream via this long-term contract. And that ultimately would translate into lower costs for consumers in the end. It also may be easier to add new resources to the grid because you wouldn't need to do any of these deliverable capacity studies. And finally, arguably, this would be a much better incentive for reliability. So say we're in a state like in Texas during the winter storm where prices are spiking. If you are a power plant that is not available and you're not in any kind of forward contract, well, then you have some lost opportunity costs. Would have been great had you been able to be available and have claimed some of those high prices, but you're not. There's only a lost opportunity cost. However, if you were in a binding long-term contract, there would be a financial penalty if you were not available during that time of system stress when prices were high. So if forward contracting is so great, why doesn't it happen already? Why isn't everybody entering into these agreements on a voluntary basis? Well, there's certainly demand for it on the side of producers. Producers generally would be happy to sign more of these long-term contracts. And with the when clean energy policy comes into play, which is encouraging these big tech companies to get renewable energy certificates, to do some carbon accounting of their data center operations, they now are happy to start signing some of these long-term PPA agreements. However, why don't more load-serving entities or retail customers want to enter PPAs or any form of long-term contract? Arguably, this is because of a couple externalities at play. The reliability and network externalities together mean that part of what we consider reliability is a common good or a common pool resource. So one of the reasons that you might underprocure or underhedge if you're a load-serving entity or a retail customer is that you don't find it very credible that you would actually be charged high prices. If you're expecting that the regulator, the government would step in and prevent those high prices from applying, then you still don't think in the future you need to do that much hedging. We've also seen how price caps can incentivize underprocurement, and as well, due to the nature of the power network, if you're equally likely to be cut off in a blackout, whether or not you're hedged, this would also lead you to not be so interested in signing a long-term contract. So in a few markets, there are mandatory forward contracts. One of these is in New Jersey, is New Jersey's basic generation service. This is a pretty old program that's opt-out, so it's the default service for retail customers. And ex post, so after the fact, all of your load is hedged. So what this means though is that you have no marginal incentives, right? So New Jersey customers don't have as much incentive to become price responsive consumers because of this, but they are protected from high prices. Another example is in Australia. Australia recently implemented something called the Retailer Reliability Obligation, which requires more contracting to happen if the central operator thinks that there is a reliability shortfall in the future. Now, importantly, this type of structure allows for load serving entities to contract with any kind of entity. It could be a bank, it doesn't necessarily have to be another generator. And of course, the more you can allow the entity at play to determine for itself what is the best way to meet that requirement, rather than being overly prescriptive about exactly how you should meet that requirement, the more efficient we think that solution ought to be. However, there are some pretty significant implementation challenges with this idea of a mandatory forward contract. So if we think about what is the first best solution, well, our first best solution would be for each consumer to voluntarily contract for its optimal fixed quantity of energy beforehand, ex ante. Deviations from that would then be bought and sold on the spot market. It would own that quantity of energy. If it wanted to consume less in real time, it would sell some back to the spot market. If it wanted to consume more in real time, it would buy some back from the spot market. This also has the implication that there is an incentive to invest in flexibility. So if I don't want to be forced to buy energy in real time at a high spot market price when my demand went up from the quantity I bought before, I would be able to respond better to those price signals and have more of a choice. So if we made this mandatory, we now have a problem, because now as a central administrator, we have to determine what is the right fixed quantity of energy for all of these different consumers to buy. And that's not a very easy question to answer. Estimating that is difficult. Selecting what form that would take is difficult. Is it ex ante load? Is it ex post load? Is it a percent of the load, the entire load? And then how would you enforce that is also difficult. One compromise would be to do something more like what New Jersey Basic Generation Service does, which is say, all right, we're going to make an easy to define product. It's ex post, whatever load you actually had, that's been hedged. But there is a trade-off there, which means that you lose the marginal incentives for any consumer under that kind of contract. So they're not going to be able to respond to prices in real time. This leads to another way of phrasing that question, which is, should this be mandatory for everyone or only small consumers? We would expect that large industrial consumers could better take care of themselves and figure out what kind of hedging contract is best for them. However, if we think that there is under-procurement even for large consumers due to all these network externalities, perhaps we're still stuck figuring out how we might make some form of forward contracting mandatory for them as well. Next, it's difficult to stop all forms of energy price suppression, right? The system operator is fundamentally a very risk-averse entity, right? And if the grid is getting to a condition where from the engineering perspective, things are looking dodgy, the system operator is pretty incentivized to start doing things, even if they, would lead to a different solution than if you let the price signals that would arise from those scarcity conditions actually unfold. There's also a risk if you move to having stronger financial incentives, like in this kind of forward contract with full strength spot prices, versus administrative oversight, which I would argue is more what a capacity market is doing, and then these muted price signals. If you have stronger financial incentives, you have a higher risk of bankruptcy. If you enter a contract and in real time you're not able to provide that power, and you would have to pay a high penalty if you didn't, at some point you might say, it's better for me to just go bankrupt than to have to buy that amount of power on the spot market. So if you're going to use these stronger financial incentives, you probably have to do more work making sure that everyone involved is creditworthy. Next is you would also have more market power concerns, arguably, when you're relying on those stronger financial incentives. Finally, another question that's yet to be determined is the price that should be at the center of these contracts. Should it be the day-ahead market? Should it be the real-time market? I would say it probably should be the real-time market, but that does mean that you're going to need to do a good amount of hedging and arbitrage, a good amount of arbitrage between the day-ahead and real-time market to make that happen. Also, is the price going to be at some hub node far away, or is it going to be the delivered price to the consumer? If it's the delivered price to the consumer, that means that whoever is supplying that forward contract is taking on some locational basis risk and has to figure out how they're going to hedge the risk that the transmission system is congested in real time. So if we put all this together, what might be close to a first best market solution? Maybe we would have something like PJM's real-time locational marginal pricing and day-ahead markets with good virtual transactions to help arbitrage between those markets. Then we would take ERCOT-style scarcity pricing, maybe before the new price cap was instituted. And we could combine that with something like a New Jersey basic generation style consumer hedging, which of course has this trade-off that anybody under that would not necessarily become price responsive demand in the future, which we often think is going to be important for keeping costs down. What would be an alternative to all of this? Like, so far, we've mostly been looking at the market solutions to this problem. Well, the alternative in the extreme would be to go fully centralized, so back to integrated resource planning. An alternative would be to go for something like a hybrid approach, where you kept the short-run markets largely as they are, and this would be the competition in the market. But then you have competition for the market in terms of governments offering competitive tenders and saying, I want to build this amount of this type of resource in the future, and I'm willing to sign long-term contracts, perhaps contracts for differences, with new generators. One example of this hybrid approach is being started in Australia, where their new capacity investment scheme has the government procuring 23 gigawatts of renewable capacity and 9 gigawatts of clean dispatchable capacity by 2030. So what are the trade-offs if we went back to this more central planning approach? Well, one trade-off is efficiency, right? So Australia has come up with these exact numbers that it estimates it should procure. What if it got those numbers wrong, right? What if it really needed 8 gigawatts of clean dispatchable capacity or 12 gigawatts of clean dispatchable capacity? We might end up with a solution that isn't as efficient as it could be if that solution had been found by using the market as a tool. Another trade-off is timing. So market entry and exit signals with resources that have long lifetimes could take a long time to reach this new clean energy equilibrium that we're trying to find. And maybe we think that's not fast enough, and we'd like to speed that up. And that question is pretty well connected with the third point here, which is that there's a missing market for carbon, right? So sure, if you had that carbon price high enough, maybe you could get the market to speed up a little bit. But ultimately, if you don't have this market for carbon, it does make it very difficult to try to procure this new clean energy future from the electricity market. But then the question becomes, if you keep the electricity markets, how do they play nicely with some of that central decision-making, central procurement, or subsidies? These are some of the questions that I'm working on currently. So one way of thinking about this would be, what is the worst case reliability that you could achieve via different kinds of mandatory contracts? So via this proposed forward energy market versus the capacity markets we currently have. Who would perform better at the edge of that design envelope, right? When resource adequacy is really in question and the system is stressed. Another question is, how do mandatory contracts change the endogenous cost of capital? So how does having these kinds of contracts that an investor has to enter into change their own hurdle rate for investment? Does it make it so that it is cheaper than to build more things in the future? Another question is there a different way that we could design these contracts so that we preserved that hedging effect to some extent, but didn't completely get rid of marginal incentives? So as we're expecting more and more demand to become price responsive and participate in energy markets, is there some way that we could define that contract to say not this fixed quantity of energy, but maybe a less than 100% quantity of the energy. So there's some marginal effect left with, say, 10% of the load being served. Or maybe we would construct a contract where there was a price floor and a ceiling rather than a fixed price. And so there was then some price responsiveness within that price band. Finally, another question is, what are the impact of subsidies on investor risk under this new forward contracting proposal? So would this play more nicely with having more centralized procurement or subsidies, or would this not work as well as some other alternatives? The methods that I'm using to look at this problem are similar to the structure we saw earlier, where there's a central planner that has an optimization problem and a market that has an equilibrium problem. However, in this case, when we're thinking about risk aversion for the consumers, for the investors, for the system operator, the central planner model is no longer the same necessarily as the equilibrium model. So we could construct an optimization model for a risk-averse optimization. But what this would really equate to is the equilibrium solution for a market with complete risk trading. And now complete risk trading isn't something that we really think exists in the real world. Usually we have risk aversion and we have partial risk trading, incomplete risk trading. But modeling an equilibrium problem with partial risk trading can be computationally very difficult. So one way of doing this might be to try algorithmically. So we might go searching via our algorithm for some stopping criteria that we think is a good equilibrium solution. However, typically with that approach, we can't say anything about the equilibrium we didn't find. So, maybe we thought, this equilibrium was great, the reliability is wonderful, but there was some other equilibria we didn't find where the reliability was much worse. So it's hard to say something rigorous with that approach. So what I'm trying to do is expand on an existing non-algorithmic solution that includes risk aversion, that currently doesn't have any risk trading, but using that as a foundation to build a model with partial risk trading to explore more of these equilibria and hopefully be able to say something a bit more robust in answering these questions. So key takeaways to wrap up here. Marginal pricing remains the optimal operational investment signal. And this is true even as we add lots of zero variable cost resources and storage to the system. However, the risk paradigm changes as that price distribution starts looking more and more skewed, with revenue being made in fewer and fewer hours. It's going to be important to manage the risk associated with that kind of volatility. One way that we could handle this would be to have price caps, have capacity markets. Another way would be to have central procurement. But as we've discussed, both of these have some pretty significant downsides. So if we were thinking, what would be a more market-based, close to first best solution? Perhaps a mandatory forward market could fit the bill. This would help not only with reliability incentives, but also hedging costs to consumers and hopefully decreasing the cost of capital for investors over time, as well as protection from high prices. And we also hope that this could at least partially help the problem along with getting things out of the interconnection queue more quickly, because you don't have to do those deliverable capacity studies. However, significant implementation challenges remain, especially in regards to, do you have this marginal incentive anymore to respond to changes in system conditions in real time? So thanks a lot for being here, and happy to take questions.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Conleigh. That was great. Before I open it up for questions from the audience, a question for you about how we can think about these various markets as this opportunity for experimentation and how to learn from them. So you gave us a number of examples, both within the US and a few international. How do you think about, as we see some markets in the world, I'm thinking about some European markets that are pushing pretty aggressively in renewables, and we think about what is that point where we're really starting to wonder about the reliability of the system? Do you have a sense of where we're going to be able to sort of learn first about what works and what doesn't in those markets? Or are there other markets in the world that you're looking at? Or are you looking at sort of what may be on the horizon in various US markets to give you insights about where to go next with your analysis of reliability?
Thanks. It's a great question. So certainly one of the issues with using all of these different electricity markets around the world as our experimental setup is that it's hard to control for all the confounding variables between them. So certainly it's not always so easy as saying, here's what happened in this market that doesn't have capacity markets. So definitely it's the capacity markets that are causing that problem. However, at the same time, there's definitely a lot we can learn from the reliability perspective via different markets today. So I think one example would be how having more inverter-based technologies, so this is things like wind, solar storage, how they contribute to operational reliability, and when do you start running into problems? So we see with a very small island system like Hawaii is going to enter that at a different stage than a bigger islanded system like Texas or Ireland. But we'll even see that, in cases where cases in the grid we're in right now, in the Eastern Interconnection, in ISO New England, where there are weak grid conditions in certain places, and we're kind of all, looking around and seeing, who's hitting these problems first and how we might learn from that.
Great, thanks. Let me open it up to questions from the audience. Professor Hogan.
So a slightly different variant on Joe's question, but it'd be interesting. So if you think about how these processes work and the conversation, this is what happened here, that's what happened there, and there's a common failure mode that you see everywhere, which is not surprising, is rent seeking. So you get all of these groups that are created under some regulatory structure, and they're getting all kinds of benefits associated with that. And now we come along and say, well, now we're going to take that away. You talked about regulatory risk, but it's also just makes it extremely difficult to make changes about anything because of all the vested interest. This is not unusual. It's not surprising. It comes in all kinds of areas, particularly with regulation. But how does that affect sort of how you think about this problem and the analytical framework?
Mm-hmm. So I think from the analytical framework, what you would want to try to model is how much of the decrease in profits that the losers in the situation had was due to that regulatory risk versus due to external factors. So I'm thinking about how in PJM there was these proposals for minimum offer price rules in capacity markets to try to kick out these renewables who were keeping prices down. And well, if you were a coal plant in Pennsylvania, you have a lot of incentive to say that the reason that you are now no longer economical and that you need this additional revenue stream is because of something external that's happening. New York is subsidizing renewables, et cetera. But in reality, that could be part of the question, but there's also a lot of different things that are happening economically at the same time, right? Like the shale gas boom. So that means that if you were modeling this, you'd have to do a good job of trying to figure out what the counterfactual is. How much of this was really due to the regulatory risk versus what is just the risk that you take by entering into a competitive market. Now, on the implementation side of that, I think that's really tricky because you're balancing this trade-off between, are you creating an environment that investors think is stable and predictable versus, or that at least they would be compensated if something if something changes about the rules of the game, versus how are you overcompensating them and having consumers foot that bill? Are you making consumers say pay to keep a coal plant online that really doesn't need to be online anymore just because they were very good at lobbying for themselves in that situation? Yeah, I think it's a big problem, both the analytical and the implementation side.
Jim.
This will show confusion on my part. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the structure of how your proposal, the forward markets, widespread, using the word mandatory, forward markets would work. So I totally get it. If I'm trying to build a nuclear plant, I would love to have, and this is your Microsoft example, I'd love to have a long-term offtake agreement, and then I just sort of get paid for that, then they get the credits and so forth. And so that's one structure. But of course that only works if that's So how do we take it from that to thinking about actually it's a local distributor that's purchasing on the wholesale market, and um, and what the incentives are that are provided, and how do we, if I'm sort of thinking this through, the nuclear plant is really clear because they're going to have potentially a pretty high cost of producing the whole thing, so they need to have this long-term agreement. If I'm a wind wind generator or solar and wind, then I guess the question is, how do I incentivize putting in or pairing that with the grid storage? I'm just trying to understand exactly how this would work in the market structure that we have, and how that would sort of complete these missing markets.
Mhm. Well, I think you've hit upon, the crux of the issue, right? Which is, do you make this mandatory or do you leave this up to being voluntary? And some parties would enter into these agreements on a voluntary basis, right? Google with its nuclear power plant in New York because it wants to take credit for that clean electricity in the form of a REC. But some producers would, left to their own devices, really like to enter these kinds of contracts, but don't find any counterparty for it because the retailers or the, distribution utilities, whoever's in charge of this, procuring this for customers, doesn't really have a strong incentive to do it. So that would be the case where you start thinking, do you want to make that mandatory? But then you have to think about, what are you giving up by doing that? And one of those things you could potentially be giving up is the marginal incentive for whatever demand that you're putting into that forward contract. If you chose for them what that fixed quantity should be, especially if you said it's, something that you would determine ex post. So, if you're a New Jersey consumer right now and, you consumed a lot more than you were forecasted to, the structure of your contract is such that you don't mind, you got the same price for it. You didn't have any marginal incentive to decrease that, even if there were high prices in real time. And if everybody on the system was in that kind of situation, I think we'd be in a bit of trouble. We'd be, acting as if we had fixed demand when we really don't have fixed demand. So we'd probably be overbuilding a system relative to what the social optimum would be. So thinking about who should you require to be in this kind of contract and who shouldn't you, and what exactly does that contract look like, are still really important questions.
I want to ask you a political question. We're in a society that we've been debating the carbon tax for about a quarter of a century here in the United States. And outside of a few states, we have not done this, even though the arguments for it are overwhelming. We're an area that has spent 20 years debating real-time pricing and still don't seem to want to do this. We've had some pilots, but we've had a very difficult time getting that done. And you're proposing a forward market that is going to rely on trusting the markets, even though you're going to have at times perturbations in which that market may be significantly higher than the real-time market. And you've also discussed this 2% where, you're going to get a lot of your revenue in 2% time, which means somebody's bill is going to be really high for July, but like 3 times or 4 times what it was for May. How do you sell this? Trust the markets. This is going to be you're going to save more money. And I think you will. I think your idea is pretty good. How do you make a compelling case if I put you in front of the National Governors Conference?
Yeah, and I think this also hits on a really important challenge with the implementation of this, is that this forward energy market, okay, it might have all of these nice benefits so long as you can convince everyone involved to let the prices be as volatile as they really are, right? If you keep suppressing those prices, then this forward energy market isn't going to be a way to recover those capital costs in an efficient way, right? So I see this going hand in hand. If you were going to go for strong financial incentives, have this forward market, you need to couple that with having full strength spot prices. If you don't think you can compromise on having full strength spot prices, then the short run market isn't going to be a good place to recover investment costs. And then now you're left with this question, do you go for a capacity market, which has a lot of distortionary effects and, maybe probably won't necessarily see us very well through to a decarbonized future? Or do you go this route of having more centralized procurement, right? And that's where this hybrid markets approach comes in. So the way that I would phrase this is, I think this forward market could be a good way to make everyone more comfortable with that volatility that you would need to get investment costs recovered from the short run market. But if you can't do that, perhaps you are better off with some kind of hybrid approach where you are determining what you think should be built. But you do have the risk there that, that central planner is not ideal. They don't have perfect information. They might come up with a suboptimal solution. But if we can't price carbon and we're going to have a lot of subsidies, that's a possibility still that you might end up in that situation.
In the back, we have a couple of questions, and then I have a question when the mic comes back up.
Thank you so much for your presentation. Following on from Professor Lee's question, are there any specific ISOs or potentially public utility commissions that you think would be more receptive to trying out something new? I understand, I'm not quite sure who you'd be going to, ISO or PUC, but I know that Connecticut's PURA has been quite innovative in looking at new initiatives and nudging utility action. So who are you thinking about as good recipients for this information?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. So there probably are a lot of utilities that are, more dealing with the retail side of things that potentially might be receptive to this kind of contract, but you of course would want to, weigh up, are you recommending something that kind of takes those customers out of the demand response, price responsive demand game? And is that, potentially not a trade-off that utility wants to make? I think on a broader scale, it's an easier sell to talk about doing something like this in a market that already has high price caps and doesn't have a capacity market. If you're talking about, would Texas or Australia implement something like this, I think it would be a little bit easier than if you're talking about, would PJM, ISO New England get rid of their existing capacity market and use this as an alternative and raise prices? Maybe there's just kind of more steps involved to do that. So if I were to make a guess, I would say you'd have more luck trying this out somewhere that already has high price caps to begin with, because most of those places have a hedging problem.
Hi, going back to carbon markets, I'm curious if you ran any estimates to determine what a fair price would be. I think on the current marketplace, it's about $4 a ton, which obviously doesn't reflect the true cost. So we're just curious to hear if you ran any assumptions.
Sure, I think that is a very important modeling assumption, is what should that price actually be? And, I think Europe's had this problem recently where they've, suddenly a bunch of permits that were inactive came back on and lowered the price. And so, if the carbon price doesn't have any teeth to it, it's not necessarily going to change market outcomes. But that's often the problem, is if it doesn't have any teeth to it, it's a little easier politically to stomach. But yes, indeed, if you really wanted to use a carbon price to change that long run outcome, it would have to be more reflective of what the true externality of carbon is. So I don't have any particular number for you due to this kind of modeling, but I definitely agree with the sentiment that it's important.
So I have a question when I sort of think about the politics of the emerging electricity system. If we're really going to decarbonize, like some people envision, we're going to have a much larger electricity system. We'll have a lot more generating capacity. A lot of this generating capacity may have lower capacity factors than what we've associated with past generating technologies because they're intermittent by their nature. I wonder, when we sort of think about this, sort of two questions for you here that are quite different. One is, sometimes it's easier for us in terms of the political economy to impose requirements on someone new entering the market as opposed to the incumbents. If we think we're going to get a lot of new capacity coming online and a lot of new users online, so whether it's someone making hydrogen, whether it's someone powering direct air capture technology, someone using electrification in heavy industry in a way that we hadn't envisioned in the past, what have you, do we think that there is a kind of transition? We don't impose mandatory forward contracts on everybody, but we do it on the new entrants. does that sort of having it both ways actually make it worse than doing full mandatory or not at all? Or could it be a way to provide a learning mechanism potentially to expand forward contracts in the future?
So I think for having a mandatory forward market, we're typically envisioning this as being an obligation on the load serving entity, right? So the consumer side, not on the producer side. And most consumers or the entities representing them already exist. So I think it would be a little bit difficult to kind of envision only applying this to new consumers. But I think the sentiment of the rules of the game have changed, and what do you do with the incumbents versus the new generators is a very important one. Something that comes to mind with this is when we're adding these new resources to the transmission system, if you wanted to have the system where you were doing more of this connect and manage approach, maybe you need to provide some kind of default hedge to the incumbent generators as well as this new generator to make up for the fact that this new generator could potentially take some of their transmission capacity. So I think this kind of ties back into Bill's earlier question is, how do you compensate the losers here, and to what extent do you compensate the losers? And maybe you give them some kind of default hedge in order to placate them.
How important is it for us to get the rules of the road at least better when it comes to new transmission? You did note when talking about ERCOT, in contrast to PJM, they have sort of this different approach to how we sort of manage the transmission, but it's also much easier with the rules within Texas to build new transmission than it is just about anywhere else in the country. So when you sort of think about how well this can work, your vision, what else do we need to do on the transmission side that could realize what you think would be the optimal outcome with forward contracting?
Yeah, the transmission question is difficult, right? Because it's somewhat of a chicken and egg problem right now, where you build a new resource and then do you build transmission, marginally for that resource, or do you think a bit more forward looking and build transmission for resources that don't yet exist? And that's, it's not an easy problem to solve. But I think the more that you can move away from myopic marginal upgrades to more centralized interregional coordinated planning, the better solution you're going to end up with. Some of that also is impacted by how the cost allocation for new transmission happens. And there's open questions there about who really benefits from the new transmission. Currently, we act as if the new generator that has to pay for these upgrades is the one benefiting from that new transmission, when in reality, it's probably consumers who now have a lower price because of this new entrant to the system that are also benefiting. So there's a lot to be kind of worked out and settled on that front as well. But I wouldn't say that the burden is only on the new generators. I think that's kind of a recipe to not build enough transmission.
Any other questions before we wrap up today? Jim.
So I'll jump in with one more since we still have a few minutes. I'm trying to sort out whether there's any issues. I think the answer to this is no, but I think whether there's any issues between a robust system of these mandatory forward contracts and virtual power plants. Because of the demand. I mean, you understand
I think I do that. If you had everyone or too many consumers in these kind of arrangements where they're fully hedged ex post, you don't have a lot of incentive to participate in virtual power plants. Yes. So I think that's a huge trade-off, right? You could design something like the New Jersey BGS system, and it's kind of clear what that contract is for, what you're doing. But you have this big trade-off, which is you lose these marginal incentives. And I think those marginal incentives are going to become more important in future as we're trying to meet, what our actual underlying utility function for consumers is, right? Because if you were in Texas during Winter Storm Uri and you were heating a pool, you probably weren't that interested in heating the pool, right? We value the electricity going to the nursing home at a much higher rate, but currently we don't really distinguish between those two uses of electricity very well. So it would be much better for overall system costs, and especially in times of system scarcity, these big reliability events, to have more virtual power plants, to have more of this price responsive demand. So it's a big trade-off. think, maybe we have to think a lot more about how to design this kind of contract to preserve some of those marginal incentives.
Yes, Bill.
Just to follow up on this, now, an important part of the New Jersey thing, which you mentioned, but I just want to clarify, is it excludes large industrial, it excludes all industrial, excludes large commercial, and it's only the residual, which is residential and small commercial, and that's an opt-out system.
Mhm.
And now, if you characterize it another way, which is you said, suppose we have flexible demand and inflexible demand. Okay, we want mandatory hedging for inflexible demand, and we don't want mandatory hedging for flexible demand.
Mhm.
That would sound a lot better, in terms of getting all of these kinds of incentives right. And that's essentially what you have in the BGS system, so that you could make the argument that all the people that are covered by the BGS system are too busy to pay attention, because they're all individually small. They're households and, local shops and so on, but they're not going to, this is not a first order problem for them. But the ones where they can really do something and do it quickly are not automatically hedged until they have the right incentives that way. So I don't give up on that. I think that's
Thanks, Bill. That was actually something I was reflecting on. I was thinking back to my youth working on the U.S. Enrichment Corporation. So this was the entity that manages the enrichment of uranium for non-military uses in the U.S. Had a facility in Paducah, Kentucky that was built around the time of World War II or right after it. And one of their major revenue streams was selling back electricity to the market when the price was high, i.e. not actually running the facility, but because of the nature of their long-term contract, they had an incentive when prices were high to shut down the facility. And so there's a question here about how do we think about these very large industrial consumers, that they might be responsive administratively, be easier to structure arrangements with them than, as you noted, with individuals or small businesses. And I think we may have more of those big consumers coming online in the future. And so how they fit within this regime, I think would be really, really important to think through. So before we wrap up, let me know, we'll meet again here in 1 week. We'll be hosting Emily Grubert of the University of Notre Dame for her talk on planning the mid-transition for a just and sustainable decarbonization. And finally, please join me in thanking Dr. Byers for her presentation today. Thank you so much, Conleigh. That was great.